Wouldn't we all just end up compensating each other? Of course, these questions are moot, since we all know that only the West is guilty of slavery and colonialism, despite having practiced it for the shortest time in the most humane manner, and with only a tiny minority of slave owners. And it was the West that abolished the practice, a practice that had been the norm for thousands of years. Let's be honest here, Western guilt and the associated calls for endless compensation and apologies are pushed by the radical left, supported by a potpourri of virtue signallers, multicultural cultists, victim vultures, and rent-seeking parasites seeking a quick and easy buck. The aim is to destroy the West and all it stands for. By peddling this built on slavery and colonialism lie, the left diminish and belittle the systems and structures that allowed the West to be so successful. Free markets, the Enlightenment, property rights, science, Christianity, all which interacted and overlapped with each other in a myriad of ways. By diminishing the achievements of the West and saying it was all down to theft, racism and colonialism makes people ashamed of who they are and what their ancestors achieved. It makes people hate themselves and reject their own civilization and culture. As the writer David Horowitz says, civilizations die when they don't believe in themselves. Western guilt is a cloud-pivot strategy designed to collapse the West. If anybody thinks that acquiescing to compensation for slavery, that's now a key topic amongst US Democratic nominees, would draw a line under the issue, or that the absurd idea of constitutional recognition for Aborigines will be the final demand, then they need their head examining. The claims would just get longer and louder. They would never end. And you know what? If a few lines in the Constitution, or some form of one-off financial compensation, if any of those things would guarantee that Aboriginal towns stopped being festering blights of alcoholism, violence, child rape and abuse, then despite my obsessive insistence that we tell the truth and do not succumb to fictions or half-truths, I would bite my tongue and get my wallet out. But it wouldn't, and everyone knows this. Most of all those making the demands. Handing out money and apologies will make things worse as it provides an excuse to those who wish to be violent. It diminishes or completely removes their responsibility, and it removes their self-determination, rendering people useless, soulless husks. What's the point of trying? The system is stacked against me. We never had a chance, they would say. As Theodore Dalrymple writes, a blanket apology and the granting of group economic privileges is hardly the way to cultivate a sense of personal responsibility in a population now decimated by alcoholism and brutalised by family violence. Quite the contrary, psychologically, if not in strict logic, it will allow a man to beat his wife and blame history. Wow. And this is exactly what the left want. A permanent underclass that will always vote for those providing them with other people's money, and an excuse as to why they can't or shouldn't try, and pull themselves up by their own bootstraps. In order to take and maintain power, the left need an impoverished underclass, a nation divided against itself, a population that hates itself and each other. The left feeds and breeds on hate. It is no accident that Aborigines who have been successful and who reject this victim narrative are abused, shouted down and demonised so viciously, because they stand as examples to others that if they applied themselves and took advantage of the opportunities laid at their feet and didn't blame their failings on racism or the fact that a handful of soldiers and convicts turned up in Botany Bay one day 220 years ago, then they might have real pride in themselves and become a success. The only successful Aborigines that are acceptable to laud are the worst examples and the most hypocritical. The millionaire sports star, the inexplicably rich Aboriginal MP, the not very Indigenous Professor of Indigenous Studies who hates herself but hates others even more. So long as they peddle the victim narrative and spread the hate, they are useful. Useful idiots, that is, to give them layman's correct term. The Western guilt narrative reduces the Western miracle to a zero-sum game, and it denies the one true ability of man to think and invent and produce value and progress mankind. It diminishes and ultimately destroys freedom, the freedom of man's mind and capabilities and potential. In short, it destroys free markets, it destroys thinking, it destroys creativity and productivity, and it destroys individuality, which just happen to be all the things the left hate and which stand in their way of power. Oh, what a coincidence. But how have we got to the stage where people who have benefited from and live in the safest, fairest and most prosperous civilization in the world to have ever existed denigrate their own culture? Well, through the seizure of the institutions. This is the so-called long march through the institutions. It should actually be called the long goose step through the institutions, because the left don't march, they only goose step. Having gained control over curriculums and higher education, the left deployed their weapons, the primary one being critical theory. Now, my very short summary of what critical theory is quite simple. You criticise everything to the nth degree, absolutely anything and everything that you need to destroy. The family unit, Christianity, free markets, free speech, men, boys, the US Constitution, Donald Trump, the Industrial Revolution, the Enlightenment, and so on. You look at the very worst aspect of anything, you amplify it, focus laser-like on one small imperfection, you blow it out of all proportion. You rant at it, you point and accuse and isolate it. You make it wear a dunce's hat. You engage in struggle sessions, march it through the streets, verbally abusing it. You silence others, deny them a voice, incessantly ramp up the pressure, incite the mob, destroy the old, make it kowtow and genuflect, and you get the students to do it. This isn't a culture war. A war suggests that there are two sides fighting. There aren't. There's only one side overturning and demolishing this culture, our culture, and rewriting history, year zero style. That's not a war, it's a revolution. A cultural revolution. Which is why there is very little difference between this and this. This selective outrage tactic is best summed up in a quote by none other than, ironically, Joseph Stalin. A single death is a tragedy, a million deaths is a statistic. I don't know if there's already a word or a phrase that describes this tactic, so I made one up. I call it the Stalinsky method. It combines Stalin and Alinsky because it has Stalin's quote combined with all the Alinsky methods rolled into one. So I call this the Stalinsky method. And how this tactic works is that you focus on one tragedy, on one death, you isolate it and blow it out of all proportion, and you keep rubbing that wound raw, and you exploit the rules and the morals of the opposition. You use language to overinflate the tragedy, such as referring to something as a massacre. Most of the so-called massacres of Aborigines are isolated from their context. Settlers didn't just wake up one morning and say, hey, let's go on a massacre. They were usually in response to tribes stealing livestock or attacking settlers, and in some cases killing them. Settlers then got together and went looking for justice. Of course, sometimes things would get out of hand, but many of those so-called massacres numbered no more than 5 or 6 dead. That's not a massacre. Amritsar was a massacre. The Nanking massacre was a massacre. What is often left out of the narratives as well is that Aborigines from rival tribes often joined in on these massacres in order to exact revenge for long-standing inter-tribal feuds. I learned this from Jacinta Price, not from Geoffrey Blaney or Keith Winshuttle. And for some reason, massacres involving warring Aboriginal tribes are included. So any Aboriginal tribes that fought each other after January 26, 1788, somehow they're lumped in, and they're all the fault of Whitey as well. So that's used to inflate figures as well. And of course, you have to take the context of the times into account. People fought over scarce resources, water and food, especially in times of drought. We don't have to do that anymore, thanks to Western technology and innovation. We have all the food we want and all the water we can drink, literally on tap. Further, the fact that people were put on trial, in the case of the Mile Creek Massacre, 7 people were executed, it shows quite clearly that they were considered as crimes and they were not authorised by the colonial powers. Any charge of genocide is false and without evidence. And we completely ignore that many settlers treated native populations with kindness and compassion, trading with them, hiring them, teaching them, and yes, taking in their children who were being abused and neglected. But no, it's better to pour poison in the ears of our children and have them hate themselves, their culture and their heritage. Just paint them picture after picture, like that of General Lion Nguyen shooting the VC prisoner, devoid of context, devoid of facts, showing one side as guilty, the other innocent. Pure cultural Marxism. Now, this isn't to say that we should do what Japan does, who go completely in the other direction, and most Japanese school children know nothing of World War II. World War II to Japan consists of 2 events, Pearl Harbor and the atomic bombs. And oh boy, do they exploit Hiroshima and Nagasaki to paint themselves as victims. The rape of Nanking is a footnote in 1 or 2 of the textbooks that are approved by Monbusho, the Ministry of Education in Japan. But generally, nothing happened between December 1941 and August 1945. Very few Japanese have heard of Bataan, the Thai Burma death railway, the sex slaves, Unit 731, the millions killed unlawfully in the Philippines, China, Korea and Thailand and so on. The Stalinsky method of teaching has warped history so badly that we have at least 2 generations of children who believe they are the worst people to have ever existed. Why do we not learn of the Royal Navy West Africa Squadron, which patrolled the coast of Africa after the abolition of slavery in 1807, at great expense in money and lives, and which freed over 150,000 African slaves? Why are we not taught of the abysmal, brutish and violent history of indigenous tribes prior to European settlement? Or the history of Islamic slavery, the gelding of males and the mass rape of females? Well, that's right, 1 million deaths. Well, it's not even a statistic apparently in our classrooms. Why are we not proud of the fact that the West built the very processes and tools and machines that enabled slavery to be ended and lifted billions out of poverty, that are seen as advanced faster than at any time in human history? If people are supposed to feel guilt or inherit crimes, then surely they can also be recipients of what was good too. And if you've got a winning formula, which is what the West has discovered, you absolutely should not be trying to denigrate and destroy it. You should be trying to spread it and tell other people about it. But you have to wonder if the left really believe in what they say. If it were true that Western societies or white people are so terrible, then why would you insist on importing billions of people into these terrible societies full of inherently awful people? And what do you think is going to happen when you teach these people that the reason they and their countries are so impoverished was because of the very societies they now live in and the people that they live next to? What is going to happen when things turn sour? And this is where writers such as David Horowitz and Douglas Murray need correcting. Western civilization isn't dying. Europe is not undergoing a strange death. It is being murdered slowly. Perhaps the greatest irony behind all this is the notion that you can inherit guilt or shame and are somehow responsible for somebody else's, another individual's past misdeeds simply because you share the same skin colour. There's a word for that, it's called eugenics. Cultural Marxism should not be called cultural Marxism, it should be called cultural eugenics, because that is what it is. The belief that certain races possess certain characteristics and inheritable traits. The fact that the left peddles this insanity shouldn't surprise anybody with a sense of history, since it was the left that were the primary believers and promoters of early 20th century eugenics. The history of the Fabian socialists has, like a Stalin-era photo, been erased from history by the academic wing of the Fabian socialists, which was, of course, the Frankfurt School, the originators of cultural Marxism, which is actually cultural eugenics. Cultural eugenics is abound today. People are given special statuses and privileges based on their skin colour, and the underlying notion that these victim groups are somehow less capable or inferior and need a special hand up or hand out. That is pure eugenics. Despite their claims to be oh so progressive, the left have not changed very much at all. Now this leads very nicely onto my last topic. You have to ask if the genocide, enslavement, invasion and occupation are so terribly bad, then why has nobody apologised for this? There are no sorry for socialism days. I can't think of a single monument that commemorates the hundreds of millions of people who died and the billions who suffered under socialism and communism, apart from that one bloke over there when they decided that that socialism was the far right. It's actually the far right of socialism, but there you go. I mean, it ticks all the boxes of the sins that the West are apparently guilty of. Forcing people to work for nothing, a kind of pseudo-slavery, actual invasions, mass slaughter, mass incarcerations, mass starvation, discrimination, persecution on the basis of religion, in the case of National Socialism, actually, and also in the case of the Soviets, who actually killed more Jews than the National Socialists did. And also in the case of the USSR and other socialist regimes, in fact all of them, they all persecuted people for being gay. But then we shouldn't be surprised. I mean, when have the left apologised for anything they've done? Kevin Rudd apologised for an event that never happened, that had nothing to do with him or anyone he apologised for. But he doesn't apologise for the thousands of people drowned when his policies dismantled the borders. Those are just accidents and tragedies that happen, according to the left. I'm not aware of anyone who died as a result of these so-called stolen generations. Au contraire, they were often saved from death. But thousands of people drowned by ending Howard's border protection policies. 4 people were electrocuted in the pink backs scandal. And an unknown number of people have died of respiratory illnesses because they can't afford to heat their homes. All as a result of policies enacted by the Rudd-Gillard governments. Yet he claims his greatest legacy was the apology which brought him all the kudos and none of the pain. This is a phenomenon that Theodore Dalrymple calls false apology syndrome. False apology syndrome is a therefore rich but poisonous mixture of self-importance, libertinism, condescension, bad faith, loose thinking and indifference to the effects it has on those who are apologised to. I think those 6 words are so perfect in describing Rudd. Self-important, libertine, condescending, bad faith, loose thinking, indifferent. Oh, it's just brilliant. Now, according to the left, you can't help the skin you are born in. Nobody chooses their genetic origins. And in some cases, they don't get to choose their religion either. So then why would you hold people to account for the skin they are born in, unless you're a eugenicist? But you can choose your ideology. People actively choose to be socialists. They actively and consciously choose to wear Shea t-shirts and attend socialism conferences and march in the street carrying hammer and sickle flags. So surely then, if anyone should be guilty or sorry, it is those that espouse socialism, as it has caused by many orders of magnitude more death, misery and suffering than any other ideology, religion and even nature itself. Amazingly, whilst the left are tearing down statues of anyone in any way connected to the evil white patriarchy or colonialism, statues of Marx are still being erected. Last year, this monstrosity of the monster was erected in his birthplace of Trier on the 100th anniversary of his birth. Why are we tearing these down? So here's what I propose. Now, any form of compensation is impossible since the only money the left have is stolen from other people. So every year what we do is we take one day to commemorate all the victims of socialism. I think May the 1st would be a good day. And on that day, all those who still promote and support socialism should, for their sins, be silent. Let's say 1/5 of 1 second for each death. That's 5 deaths a second. Now, given that an estimated 150 million people died under various socialist regimes, and there are 32 million seconds per year, then they would have to remain silent for the entire year until the following May the 1st came around, when they would begin the process all over again. Or, to put it another way, the left should shut their big, fat, hypocritical mouths permanently and take a good, long, hard look at themselves before they even dare to pick up a stone in the extremely fragile glass house that they choose to live in. What is absolutely critical for us to understand in this debate is that the left are at war with Western civilization. And as Sun Tzu said, all warfare is based on deception. We have been tricked into believing West bad, everyone else good, because of the deception of history. If we don't recognise this as a war, then, well, it's already become a revolution. And trust me, you don't win a war by being defensive, you go on the attack. Make no mistake, this Western guilt concept is about power. The left wants power over you. The power to stomp their boot on your face forever. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Geoff Grimshaw. There's a lot of material there to keep us awake at night. And I personally will be thinking of your talk as I try to sleep, and I may not succeed. And I'd like now to introduce our third speaker, Luke TORRIsi. Luke TORRIsi was born and raised in Sydney, educated at Trinity Grammar School, and under the auspices of Rob West, to whom he, excuse me if I go slow on this, will you, because I ain't necessarily an IT person, to whom he owes his higher classical education. He completed degrees in literature, history and law, and acquiring a formidable reputation as a public speaker and a debater along the way. He practiced law for 15 years and also ran an Australia's only conservative radio program on 88.9 FM. He has interviewed and jousted with the likes of Peter Hitchens, Roger Scruton, Mark Stein. He organised a number of social networks designed to further the cause of tradition, with a strong focus on people self-educating as to what their traditions really are. He's now completing a PhD in political philosophy. His attention is focused on writing, poetry, public speaking and teaching. He has taken on the role of the grey eminence behind the minds of many political movements and parties in New South Wales and other states, including ghostwriting, known for his extensive and formidable personal library. Colleagues have described him as the John Wick of Australian conservatism, because when he argues his point, he puts one bullet in the heart and another in the head. So you don't take prisoners. And I must apologise for my halting delivery, my spastic delivery of this, because I'm reading from your iPhone And don't take readily to iPhones, and I have lost your bio. That's why I'm doing this, and I hope you were aware of his many distinguishing credits. Welcome, Luke TORRIsi.
Thank you, David. Yes, I know the outfit well. How could I resist? Turning up at a function like this, everyone said, come dressed for a clan meeting, so here I am. And what a pleasure it is. I'm probably not going to say the things that you think I might say. If I don't use microphones. If I get the chance to, I might delve into one of my books that I've slightly read and got my head around to explain some things in literary detail that I normally don't get the chance to when I make an address. Western guilt. Where do I stand? I stand here saying guilty, guilty, guilty. The West has plenty to be guilty about, and it should feel guilty. The West should be sweating profusely in so much guilt it could swim to the other bank. Why? What are we guilty for? We are guilty, in my view, of one of the greatest sins that a people can commit. They have forsaken themselves, their tradition, and their ancestors. They have turned their back on everything most ancient that made them what they are and said, I don't need to know about this anymore. And for that, the West is guilty. And I want to look tonight at some anecdotal examples in my life that have really struck home to me how damaging we have been to ourselves as Westerners. And I'd like to think that I could suggest perhaps what we could do about it and what to avoid next. You see, the first problem we have is that we place too much faith and reliance still in our institutions and elites, and we think that they are actually working for Western tradition and that they are keeping things alive, when that's exactly what they're not doing. Now, I consider myself a conservative. In fact, I know I am, a traditionalist one at that. But yet we constantly bestow that title upon people who simply don't deserve it. And if you want to look at people who are completely and utterly treacherous towards Western tradition and yet seem to acquire titles as if they are patrons of it, look no further than one of the greatest traitors that this country has ever had the misfortune to interact with. And I'm talking, of course, about John Howard, a man who stands before his people saying, oh, I'm looking after you because of Australia's values, democracy and freedom, and with our freedom we'll have more democracy so that we can have freedom and jobs and growth. Don't forget the jobs and growth. Well, I overcame a recession and a global financial crisis. Yeah. But what did you do for Western tradition? I'll tell you what you did. You globalised it. You diluted it. You said there is no identity. You abstracted it. You took it away from the concrete and you made it a complete and utter abstraction. Democracy, freedom, oh, fair go, mateship. What does any of that mean? What concrete thing is it actuated in? What is it based upon? I gave a speech at an Australian Conservatives conference. Actually, there was two. There was a dinner afterwards. And I had some fellow getting all upset at this notion and suggesting that, oh, but everything comes from ideas, the great cogito ergo sum of the Enlightenment. Well, pre-Enlightenment actually, it was more the scientific revolution at that stage. When we were starting to lose elements of what made us what we were. We were starting to lose the ancient. We were starting to deride the medieval. Don't forget where the term medieval came from. It's a Renaissance term designed to put things in perspective, because we're our own gods now, and we're on a path to progress that isn't going to stop. And the problem is that we've had leaders like John Howard who've said to us that, don't you worry folks, we're on the progress train, I'm taking you there. But in the process of doing so, they have decided that the who and what, the we, is now an abstract. It's a set of values, it's nothing concrete. The ancient Egyptians didn't do that. When they decided that their guiding concept of law and honour, known as ma'at, they derived it from the patterns of the River Nile. They first noticed this mound arising from the river and said, this is what allows us life. This physical happening, this concrete event, is what allows us to be who we are, and it tells us what our civilization is. A concrete fact and phenomena particular to that people and that culture. And the hieroglyph for ma'at, the concept of justice and rightness and proper behaviour, is derived from the mound arising from the Nile. And all these notions of things concrete that are particular to a particular people and culture that built and made something are being denied and abstracted in a pursuit of a global economic forum in which we merely have workers, production units, and individuals who are post-cultural. And that, ladies and gentlemen, to me, is a tragedy of such monumental proportions that it should attract a horrible sense of guilt. Guilt, incidentally, being an Old English, indeed an Anglo-Saxon word, quite particular, meaning, in its original sense, not just guilt in a legal sense, but guilt in a moral sense as well. These abstractions that false conservatives like to peddle to us are what we must avoid like the plague if there is to be a single ounce of tradition left. If there is to be any sense of distinction and hierarchy and culture available to anyone on the planet, we must stop abstracting ourselves into one big ball. There's a famous novel by Arthur C. Clarke that C.S. Lewis suggested everyone read, called Childhood's End, where he talks prophetically but positively about the evolution of humanity to a point where it transcends itself. It's a bit like 2001: A Space Odyssey, another one of his, about man overcoming his infantile notions of faith and art and becoming something more transcendent. And in Childhood's End, humanity